I'm Yolanda Rome. I guess I'm facilitating this, Racialized State Violence. These are our wonderful panelists that have some really great projects. Go ahead.
Yep. So hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. We're going to introduce ourselves real quick and also try to see how this clicker works. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, Victor, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Okay, sure.
So
Hi,
match
I'm
the
Victor.
pictures.
I'm a senior concentrating in modern culture, media, and ethnic studies, and I work at the Curricular Resource Center as a fellowships, internships, and research experiences coordinator.
Hi, my name is Myacah Sampson. I concentrate in public policy and ethnic studies. I was co-coordinator of Native Americans at Brown, along with Phoebe Young.
And Kasara.
Oh yeah, and I was also the coordinator of the Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Relationship Abuse.
Yeah. And I'm Phoebe Young. I'm concentrating in history and ethnic studies. And yeah, I was the co-coordinator for Native Americans at Brown last year and also the co-coordinator for Kasara. This year I was just mostly a thesis writer. I'm a Scorpio. Yeah. And I'll also be going first in this presentation. Okay. So my thesis project and the thing that I'll be presenting on today is called Reimagining Brown 250+, Histories of Violence in the Making of an American University. And so my thesis is primarily from actually pre-1764, so it looks really at Brown's founding in 1764 and extends backwards into Providence's founding in 1636, so looking at what the mechanisms of dispossession and the histories of violence were leading up to Brown's founding, and really centralizing those narratives and understanding those as very integral to the way in which Brown came into being, right? So in the way in which we have this kind of liberal institution that embodies a lot of these ideas of free thought, free speech, free religious inquiry, and thinks about what the costs were, and understands that those costs really as not as collateral or as aberrations, but really as central to Brown's founding. But the way in which I came into a lot of these questions was looking at and experiencing the 250th anniversary celebration, when the university, according to its 250th website, was hoping to build community, enhance external relations and profile, while also campaigning for the 214 plan put forth by the university's Building on Distinction, a new plan for Brown. And during this year, or during this 444-day celebration, it was global. It was an anniversary that sought to be true to Brown's past, explore Brown of today, and imagine Brown of tomorrow. And so my thesis is primarily concerned with what Brown missed when it was exploring its own past, and how that reverberates into the present, and what that kind of means for imagining Brown's tomorrow, or just imagining tomorrow more generally. And the celebration was very decadent. It had a big old cake that reportedly, according to some of my sources, may have cost a couple $1,000s, maybe tens of thousands, I don't know, unconfirmed, but it was a lot. And it also had, at the same time, kind of folded into the celebrations, the unveiling of the Slavery Memorial and the opening of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And that came out of the recommendations from the 2006 Slavery and Justice Report. And so some of what my research is thinking through, there's the Slavery Memorial designed by Martin Puryear, and also the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice just down the road. And so some of what my research thinks through is it's working off of a lot of the findings of the Slavery and Justice Report, while also thinking through a cultural analysis of this celebration and of Brown's history, and kind of New England's history as a whole. So in particular, the Slavery and Justice Report starts with looking at some of the different relics of the slave trade and the ways in which the founders of Brown were involved in the slave trade, and it situates that in University Hall, which makes for a very interesting contrast to the way in which we celebrate Brown, which involves a big old cake of University Hall. So the unveiling of each of these different items that came out of the report kind of demonstrate the critical moments of university-led reflections on their past and on its own origins. But I think the fact that both of these events were marketed and advertised within the 250th anniversary celebration of Brown also demonstrates that the university-wide reflection still has a lot of work that needs to be done, and there's still a lot that we need to think through. So in particular, some of my research questions while watching these celebrations unfold were, how do we create historical silences on Brown's campus when we're celebrating and when we're remembering? How is there also this dual process of forgetting? And what histories are forgotten in order for the campus to very uncritically celebrate its origins in 1764? And lastly, how does this present-day violence or how does this present-day process of forgetting histories of violence continue to uphold colonial logics established in the 17th and 18th centuries? So, my thesis stuff. So the primary aim of my thesis is to bridge this gap between historical memory, specifically of Native displacement in Providence, and also the transatlantic slave trade, and really to demonstrate the ways in which Native displacement, the slave trade, and the founding of Brown were all deeply interwoven processes. And at the heart of this discussion, I wanted to situate and view the founding of Brown as a physical culmination of the colonization efforts that were behind the making of Rhode Island. So racialized violence, like Native American displacement and African enslavement, as I was previously saying, are not just aberrations of Brown's founding, but are in fact very central to Brown's founding. Got an extra bullet point. So some of the methodologies and frameworks, if you're familiar with Michael Roth-Trio, I'm sorry, I don't speak French to save my life, and his work Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History, a lot of what I'm working with takes from and draws from those theories that he puts forth. It's also an archival analysis, so a lot of my research looks at these documents that are pretty well known, so things like land deeds, things like slave ship documents, but kind of analyzes them through a different lens and through a lens that understands them as a very long process of colonization. And then it's also a cultural analysis and critique of the historical narratives that we tell, whether that's within New England or within Brown. And then it's also a cultural analysis of Brown's celebration. And some other theorists and historians who have also guided my work include Christine Clark-Pujara, Patricia Rubertone, Jill Lepore, Greg Grandin, Margaret Newell, Jean O'Brien, if any of you know those folks. A lot of their work has also been a very big guidance in this. So I start primarily with King Philip's War and the founding of Rhode Island. So colonial land acquisition after King Philip's War fundamentally changed the relationship of settler-colonial terms of power to Native peoples in the area. But the settler attempts to entrap Native peoples within colonial rule and Native resistance to this web of entrapment date much farther back in the timeline of Rhode Island colonization. So in order to understand Rhode Island, Providence, and Brown University and how all of these institutions came into existence, it's also necessary to understand this kind of interwoven web of colonial violence and how that really plays out in these quotidian processes of land deeds, of letters, of documents, right? And so that's something that Edward Said refers to as like the quotidian process of hegemony. So how is that established, and how do we understand and conceive of all of those acts as acts that are violent and that really hinder Native lifeways in a lot of different dimensions within the region and ultimately lead up to King Philip's War. So that's a lot of what the sort of first chapter of my thesis looks at, is looking at what sort of violences of founding are involved in Rhode Island. And so it's a long process of Wampanoag, Narragansett, Neantic, and Nipmuc land dispossession and a parallel process of colonial accumulation. And then just in terms of a timeline aspect, King Philip's War is happening from 1775 to 1776, and it's an allied Native uprising that's led by the Wampanoag Sachem Metacom. And it's also one of the bloodiest wars in New England's history, especially per capita. And at the war's end, Native American captives are shipped into slavery in the West Indies, and that's a really crucial link in my thesis, is understanding how Native land dispossession and also Native dispossession of the kind of dispossession of Native peoples and persons is connected to the dispossession within the transatlantic slave trade, especially within Rhode Island's entry into the transatlantic slave trade, and also into the accumulation of wealth for colonists, right? So In looking at that and understanding some of that, what's happening after the war when natives are sold into captivity, I wasn't able to find exact numbers, but it's at least a couple hundred native peoples throughout New England are sold into that war and sold into slavery. And some of what that does is that provides colonists who are in the region, who also then go on to found institutions like Brown University, to accumulate capital from their sale and also to accumulate the land that was once native homelands. So when we look at places like Bristol and South Kingstown, which are also known as the main hubs of the transatlantic slave trade and of the plantation complex in Rhode Island, those are also native homelands, right? So that's also where the Narragansett peoples used to be and still are, and that's also where the Wampanoag homelands were. So the Slavery and Justice Report, by the 18th century, along the shorelines of the Narragansett Bay, after King Philip's War, there is a massive slave-based economy that's unfolding in the 18th century Rhode Island. And in 2003, Ruth Simmons puts together a task force to look into Brown University's legacy and involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. And its findings include that the colony was in the midst of building its distinction as the largest slave hub in North America, with some 60% of slave trading voyages launched in Rhode Island and up to 90% in some years. And then by the close of the 19th century, Rhode Islanders had mounted, according to the report, at least 1,000 voyages carrying over 100,000 Africans into New World slavery. And so Rhode Island essentially acted as the commissary of the Atlantic plantation complex. So what that meant was they were, breeding horses to then be sold onto the plantations in the English West Indies, and they're selling a lot of, massive amounts of dairy products. And there's one line in the Slavery and Justice Report that says it was quite literally, the business of the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. So at every level of Rhode Island's economy in the 18th century, there is an involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. And it's being done on land that was dispossessed from native peoples. And so, one second. So part of what I'm looking at is I'm taking some of what the Slavery and Justice Report started with in looking at the Brown family, but I'm also expanding that into looking at the corporation members of Brown, so thinking through who is coming together in the 18th century to found an institution of education. And for the most part, that's the people who were involved in the dispossession of native lands and who are also involved in the entry of Rhode Island into the transatlantic slave trade, so kind of like the big wigs. And then they're also the people who are involved in the state legislature. So there's a very, again, a very interwoven process within all of this. So some of the people, for instance, that I look at are Stephen Hopkins, the Hazard family, Jeremiah Niles, and it's a pretty long process, so I'll try and give you all like a kind of quick summary of some of that. So for instance, Stephen Hopkins is the governor of Rhode Island in the mid 18th century, and he is also involved in funding Rhode Island's entry into the French and Indian War, which is an interesting reinforcement process of dispossession and enslavement, because there's a lot of the profits from molasses and rum that Rhode Island is producing are then being used to purchase weapons for colonial expansion further west and into other native territories. And he's also one of the signatories of the original Brown Charter. So it's kind of like a glimpse into how slavery, dispossession, and colonial expansion are kind of all moving together in the early days of Brown's founding. So just as the colonization of native homelands in Rhode Island had allowed colonists to enter into the transatlantic slave trade after 1676, the capital accrued from the transatlantic slave trade in turn also allowed English colonists to fight for their right to expand into other native peoples' homelands. So in conclusion, I think that a lot of what my thesis brings to the table in terms of questions is that we need to think a lot more about what is obscured in Brown's history, and that's really crucial to our understanding of this university, just as much so as what we celebrate oftentimes, if not more so in my opinion. And Brown University's founding needs to be understood as part and parcel of the long history of colonization and slavery within Rhode Island that has made possible to create this educational institution. So there are two quotes that I kind of used to think about in my conclusion. The first is, again, by Michel Rolfe-Trouillot. He says, "Thus, even in relation to the past, our authenticity resides in the struggles of our present. Only in that present can we be true or false to the past we choose to acknowledge." And in a similar vein, Saidiya Hartman also talks about this notion of the afterlife of slavery and says, "If slavery persists as an issue in the political life of Black America, it is not because of an antiquarian obsession with bygone days, but because Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery." So I think that, in short, given that we do need to think a lot about how Brown's inability to acknowledge very fully these interwoven histories of violence as they pertain to Brown's ability to accumulate capital, Brown's ability to accumulate status, and Brown's ability to continue on for 250 years. And we also need to think a lot more about how histories of violence are central to that, and in essence need to kind of reimagine what Brown 250 was and what Brown 250 is going to be, given those things. Yeah.
Hi. Is she working? There you go. So yeah, my project is Watts, 1965. Undominating photography of protest, riot, and rebellion. So like a lot of other Black people, I think much of the last few years have been marked by the high-profile deaths of Black people at the hands of police or vigilantes. I think Trayvon Martin's death, while I was still in high school, was the first victim who really entered my consciousness. In some ways, that event has really led me to spend a lot of my time here researching and writing about racialized violence. So this project, like some of my other work, is intended as a direct critique of a particular form of narrating historical events of racialized violence, especially those employed by journalists who write and rewrite history through their writing about the present. Many of the recent high-profile cases of police brutality demonstrate the approach I'm talking about as a journalist's attempt to make sense of the complex responses of communities across the country to these events. So the response to the death of Freddie Gray is a sort of easy example of this. As journalists and regular people invariably refer to the events localized in Baltimore as riots, unrest, protests, an uprising, and as a rebellion. Whichever terms they use to describe the event, then representing something about what they actually want to say about it. So whether that's CNN's association of the events with looting and violence, or the Socialist Workers website emphasizing the events as a sort of authentic rebellion of Black consciousness in this moment. And while sort of some of the scholarship currently is focused on how journalists construct the quote-unquote police use of force incidents, less work is, I think, focused on the use of images and videos and constructing those narratives. In many articles, especially with the glossy web pages of the internet, the textual construction of the event is often accompanied by images which are meant to serve as visual evidence or correspondence of the article's text. So in this way, the work of historical construction by journalists is treated as self-evident rather than as a particular work that goes into it, right? So it's like, these are the photos that just sort of represent scenes of chaos. This is the scene of chaos. And so since integrals are sort of, or since images are sort of integral to this process of history construction then, I wanted to understand how we might practice a different approach to the narration of history by practicing a different approach to these images of these highly contested events. If we can take a step back from treating these images as self-evident or obvious, it might also show us a more critical approach to historical narration for both professional journalists and sort of regular people as well as people in the academy. And so the 50th anniversary of what is commonly known as the Watts riots or rebellion provides a great opportunity for this sort of interrogation, as it allows me to sort of step back even further from the initial response to the event and understand not only how divergent narratives were mobilized then, but the effects of these sort of narrow narrations of the event today. So yeah, this project, sort of unlike a lot of my other work, is not heavily theoretical. It's more of a photography project. I'm not an artist, so we'll sort of spend more time looking at images than me just reading quotes to you. So for some brief background, the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, California, was a predominantly black neighborhood produced through a combination of historical factors. One of the primary of these is the Second Great Migration, which started in roughly 1941, where many black Southerners moved to the North, Midwest, and West in search of jobs, many of which were created in the boom of World War II. Discriminatory housing and so discriminatory housing practices such as restrictive covenants, which sort of restricted who could sort of own particular property, as sort of on the left, which is an image of a sign that says this tract is exclusive and restrictive, meaning black people cannot buy any property here, right? And then there's the sort of public housing projects that were created in order to house this new black population, as on the right, which is an architectural model of one of these sort of public housing projects in Watts, Pueblo del Rio. And this was constructed in 1941, right as the Second Great Migration was starting. And so these two things sort of created a situation where, you know, there's these new black workers coming in for these particular jobs, and we can move them this particular cheap housing in this area and sort of concentrate them into these areas where they can be exploited, but they're not sort of in the way or, you know, disrupting the sort of overall flow of the things that people want to happen. And so this concentration of the black population in Los Angeles would provide some of the grounds for the arrest of Marquette Frye on August 11th, 1965, which would escalate into what is then referred to as the Watts riots or Watts Rebellion, which is one of the most resonant events in Los Angeles' history before the 1992 LA riots. There had been some previous race riots in other parts of the country, both in 1964 and 1965, and the Watts riots sort of eclipsed, you know, all of these, both in terms of property destruction and people who were killed. Incidentally, most of the people who were killed by the National Guard and police officers. And so, let's talk about the project. So to work against the sort of strictly journalistic approach to these images of the event, I worked with them to produce 9 different collages. This approach tries to engage with the image and text as relating to each other complexly, rather than directly correlating with each other as in a sort of newspaper. So thinking more zines than the New York Times. Here's one of the collages I made, and then you can sort of, it's very dense, I realize, so you can sort of look at it, and then I'll start talking again. This sort of first collage that I'm showing you centers on an image of black people in a large grouping with a police car in the foreground. It can be read along the lines of De La Rosa created this communist pamphlet where they collected, quotes from people about the rebellion and, are really trying to sell a particular line about it. So you can be read along the lines of that pamphlet to think about where they're sort of trying to champion the revolutionary character of the riot, with the sort of three-finger salute being read as the quote-unquote blood brother passing signs, which indicate the, quote, fraternity and solidarity that characterize the uprising, unquote. On the other hand, are the headlines like, quote, would chemicals have quelled the riot? And why the rioting? Alongside the quote from the McCone Commission, which is a government-sponsored commission on the causes of the riots. And so in this sort of other narrative, the revolutionary character of the quote-unquote rebellion becomes the unthought, irrational, and pathological character of the quote-unquote riots. In the former narrative, the grouping is a bursting of the political through the irrationality of state repression, while in the latter, the grouping itself is the irrationality, which needs to be dispersed and destroyed in order for the political to occur. And I think we should ask ourselves, how both of these readings also obscure this sort of last headline, Black Man Takes a Look at the Los Angeles Riot. And we can think about black man in quotations here. And so it should make us ask, if a quote-unquote black man takes a look at the riots from the outside, then how is it that he can be a part of either the monolithic construction of the, revolutionary mass of black people, black men specifically, or these sort of unruly, dangerous mass of black rioters? When we read this mass in this photograph, what besides their blackness and their presence within the frame of the photograph, in relation to the camera, should actually make us even believe that they are somehow a unified mass. So those are some of the questions on that. So let's go to the next one, and then, I'll give you some time for it. So this second collage centers on an image of two people running with large items in their hands as one of them looks into the camera, seemingly smiling. The two quotes from De La Rosa and the headline, "Poverty, an Underlying Factor," attempt to explain the causes of the riots and the material dispossession and poverty of the black community, as well as the intense feelings of shared joy and hatred of the white shop owners. The two other headlines attempt to represent the public opinion of the riots as some combination of disbelief, fear, and disapproval. As with our previous image, it would be easy to identify it as following one or the other narrative, but the image may still confound our attempts to categorize it wholly. Sure, they are running with something through public space, but what does that actually tell us about these items? Or are they stolen? Or does that make them looters? And, the expression of the person on the left does seem like a smile, but does that imply that they are somehow joyfully taking their revenge against the discrimination of white shop owners or joyfully reversing the flow of capital? And truthfully, can we even tell what they're holding or what they're doing? Though it would be easy to count this image as obvious, we nonetheless have nothing to go off of besides the seeming look into the camera. But what does this actually tell us beside the apparent presence of the photographer? Why presume we know anything at all about these people and their motives, except toward our own ends as spectators to the event, mediated through the photograph? And then we can go to this last one. And so this third collage centers on the image of a Los Angeles Department of Water and Power lineman attempting to repair the damage to an electric pole which was burned and snapped during the rioting. If we recall the discriminatory housing policies and public housing projects that concentrated the black population into the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, we can read this public utility being repaired as part of the projects of governance. Through formal and informal mechanisms, the local, state, and national government attempted to produce a productive space for these black people to live and work so they could provide their labor to the war effort and to later U.S. industry in LA, without being in the way or disruptive. With this in mind, we can then consider the narration of this event as part of the, quote, insensate rage of destruction, unquote, or a pathological desire to destroy, or on the other hand, as a discreet and noble response directly to the authorities, as in the threat to literally burn Police Chief Parker and Mayor Yorty alive. My question I want to ask here, as an extension of the previous clauses, is how we might either of these more narrow narrations play a role in reproducing the structured environment of governance produced by the white supremacist state. Is our effort to repair the narrative after the fact not also part of the mechanisms for taming the complex narrative of the event and the people who participated in it, who lived and died in the Watts section of Los Angeles, after being funneled into an environment which was supposed to enable their exploitation? Do we not facilitate the exploitation of their memories by acting as though we could easily know and understand what an event like this means for all of its participants, bystanders, victims, and perpetrators? And so that's what brings me to this last juxtaposition, which isn't one of my original collages, but something put together for this presentation. So there's an event in the foreground of these images that might seem obvious, and yet it still blurs. The background rages on in ways we can never know or have access to. In what should make us ask not only what we are missing about the more obvious scene in the foreground, but also what conditions of violence make some people's stories seem more obvious, which is to also ask, why is it so easy to interrogate Trayvon Martin's story, for example, and not George Zimmerman's? And so for those in the academy and who work as journalists, such a question is incredibly important, as we have the power to construct and reconstruct the narratives of events like this, and we can easily make the events fit into whatever mold we choose. This power is more obvious with examples like this from over 50 years ago, but is equally vital in our work today, and when we consider complex events where people act with all the complexity of people, not characters in a 500-word news story or obituary.
Thank you.
So this is my capstone, Land of Entrapment, Resisting State Violence in New Mexico. And I grew up in New Mexico, but I think I began to first approach the topic of police violence specifically in New Mexico fall of my sophomore year in a policy class called State and Local Government, in which I was assigned to debate a hot topic in local governance. And at that time, there's a lot of talk about body-worn cameras and their potential to perhaps influence police behavior. I chose to argue against body cameras, mostly for the challenge of it, because I wanted to see what I would find. And at that time, being against body cameras made me look a bit out of touch. Popular dialogue centered on the killing of Michael Brown, and many of us hoped that video footage might help us convict his killer. And policy wonks often cited a study conducted in Verlado, California, that claimed the presence of body cameras reduced police use of force. The logic seems simple enough. People behave better when they know they're being watched, and why should cops be any different? In my debate, I cited an incident that occurred earlier in New Mexico in March. Police murdered a homeless man, James Boyd, camped in the Sandia foothills. I had heard of the case, and I heard of the protest that it sparked, but I hadn't brought myself to watch the footage of his death captured on a helmet camera. In watching it, I was forced to confront the falsehood that cameras might change how police choose to use their tasers, attack dogs, assault rifles, flash grenades, and beanbag projectiles. All of these were used on Boyd. It became apparent that there had always been something deeper at work to foster such an utter disregard for life. something that couldn't be prevented with the presence of a camera and couldn't bring justice even with seemingly irrefutable evidence. So I opened with the story of James Boyd in my capstone because it represented not only a turn in my thinking about police violence, but it was the event that brought national attention to the issue of police brutality in New Mexico. News articles cited a Department of Justice investigation. News articles and the Department of Justice cited that Boyd's death was not unique. Albuquerque police had shot about 40 people in a 5-year period and killed about 20 of them. The Department of Justice found that the police engaged in a pattern of unconstitutional use of deadly force, especially against the mentally ill and homeless. And while this was vindicating for a lot of the protesters and myself, it also worked to limit how we talk about police brutality. Albuquerque's police department was discussed as if it had gone wild or broke bad, which suggested that there weren't nearly identical situations in other cities in New Mexico and across the country, and it implied that there was a time when things hadn't always been like this. Also left out of this discussion was any mention of the fact that Native Americans are the racial group most likely to be killed by police. It didn't mention the scores of homeless Native Americans who die in the streets of Gallup, New Mexico due to exposure. It did not mention the reduced funding to mental health services and shelters under the governorship of Susana Martínez or the mayor of Albuquerque, Richard Berry, that rendered nearly 6,000 people homeless in Albuquerque in 2014. It was during this time that an organization called the Red Nation was formed. They recognized that this violence was not spontaneous, but a continuation of settler colonial practices. As such, these practices disproportionately target Native Americans who must be eliminated to hide the fact that this country was built upon stolen indigenous land, and that land is then made to be profitable. They ask, what does it mean to not think of these deaths as aberrations, but as rational outcomes of a political economy that produces poverty through austerity? What does it mean to not think of these deaths not as the wars coming home, but a continuation of domestic wars that never ended? So my capstone draws from the Red Nation's materialist approaches to understanding police violence in New Mexico as a marriage between the processes of capitalism and colonialism, which produced the premature deaths of the racialized poor. I chose to foreground them because I believe that people who directly engage with communities, people who bear the brunt of the failures of the economy, can best pinpoint us to the problems and develop the best solutions. Better than a policy wonk looking to behavioral economics to incentivize cops to not shoot people. I argue that the disproportionate rates of New Mexico's racialized poor are embedded in geographically specific histories of social formation. So my research questions include, in what ways does the Red Nation shed light on issues of state violence in New Mexico that have been absent from both state and media accounts? What significance does political economic history bear on criminalization in New Mexico? And is the settler colonial analytic capacious enough for solidarity building efforts? So the Red Nation defines an anti-Indian common sense. This concept draws from Dakota scholar Elizabeth Cook Lynn's notion of anti-Indianism, which she defines that which treats the Indians and their tribes as if they don't exist, as well as Antonio Gramsci's theory of common sense. It is defined as an ideology that what is commonplace is natural. An anti-Indian common sense exists in New Mexico cities where Native Americans are expected to live on reservations, which are perceived as sites of chaos and disorder. Municipal leaders in New Mexico have described natives as transients or inebriates who spill onto border towns and stir up trouble. Nick Estes of the Red Nation elaborates. People don't necessarily think that Indians aren't supposed to exist. It's just normalized in how they perceive their reality. People can celebrate and mourn the passing of the Indian, but they can't actually confront the existence or persistence of indigenous life in cities because Indians don't belong here. If we look at the numbers, in 2014, Native Americans comprised 4.6% of Albuquerque's population, but made up 13% of the city's homeless community. Native people across the state report officers confiscating their IDs to ensure that they are unable to purchase alcohol, which also leaves them unable to obtain housing, social services, medical care, or even the means to identify their bodies when many of them are found dead from exposure or vigilante violence. I'm trying to get to the slave code. Oh, there we go. I also look at New Mexico's slave code. In 1861, Congressman John A. Bingham of Ohio described New Mexico's slave code as a law that would have, quote, brought blushes to the cheek of Caligula. During the secession crisis of 1861, New Mexico's territorial delegate in the House of Representatives, Miguel Otero, defended the territory's slave code as being rooted in a plain, simple sense of justice, not trammeled by sectional prejudices and not influenced by fanaticism. Otero was influenced by his marriage to the daughter of a prominent slave-owning family from South Carolina. He recognized that New Mexico territory was not ideal for the large-scale plantation enterprises of the South, but that he could encourage economic development and white migration to the state by enacting a harsh slave code. New Mexico has never had a large black population, yet its laws have gone to great lengths to control and police this group. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, African Americans and Black Americans constitute less than 7% of the state's population, but are overrepresented in the state's prisons by more than 4%. And of course, you can also see that whites are underrepresented in the state's prison population. Native Americans are also overrepresented, and as are Latinos. I also examined power negotiations in 19th century New Mexico. Professor of law Laura E. Gomez has laid the groundwork for this work by employing Omi Monat's theory of racial formation. Through review of criminal process and litigation in San Miguel County, she identifies 4 distinct racial projects among middle-class Mexican people, Mexican elites, lower-class men, and white elites. Gomez concludes the social positioning of Mexicans in New Mexico during this time period was distinct from that of African Americans in the Jim Crow South and that of Mexicans in Texas. White supremacy was asserted by keeping New Mexico a territory until more Euro-Americans migrated to the area, as Mexican inclusion in the court system became a mode through which Mexicans maintained a certain degree of social power. So there was a point in the 19th century where whites were overrepresented in social crimes. This was due to the fact that they were being tried by juries that were comprised mostly of Mexican Americans. And Gomez's distinction between middle-class and elite Mexicans in the region can help to explain our contemporary phenomenon of Latinx overrepresentation in New Mexico's prisons today, coupled with significant representation in local government and law enforcement. Here's a quote from her. I'm sorry to bombard you with a wall of text. But she says, the relative spectacle of European American defendants' trials by Mexican juries must have been a powerful reminder that Mexicans were not in the same position of blacks and that New Mexico is not the South. Ultimately, European American elites had to assert white supremacy in other ways. They blocked statehood until more European Americans populated the territory. They held the most important positions, and Congress retained the right to overturn any law passed by the majority Mexican territorial legislature. And I don't think I have an inspirational quote to leave you on, but this is from the end of Jordan Camm and Christina Heatherton's Policing the Planet, written by Vijay Prashad. The common sense of our times will lead us to a bad end. Foolishness needs an antidote. Consider this the fool's silence.
Thank you. I think we should give another round of applause to these very accomplished projects that we just heard. So one of the things that I felt as I was listening to these is angst and anxiety, anger, and I'm wondering how were you able to deal with that? Because obviously these topics are very important and crucial to your upbringing, your lives now, your future lives. So how have you found ways to separate your emotions from your actual work? Or have you been able to?
Go ahead, Victor. Go.
I mean, I feel like it's real hard. I feel like it's very easy to get burned out talking about these kinds of topics, and I don't know what the best way to deal with it is. I feel like the only thing that's been helpful to me is working on multiple different projects. That's why if you go to any other presentations I'm giving, they'll all be on different projects. You'll never hear about this project ever again.
If you'll remember our introductory slides, I am an Aries. I am motivated by anger. I channel a lot of these emotions into my work. And I think this is how I process a lot of this violence and really allow myself to mourn it and imagine a better future.
I think for me, because my work was so located on Brown's campus, and also because it was I really started doing this research project like the minute I got to Brown. So it's been a long time coming. I think like a lot of what I don't expect to find hope in big things. So I think it's just kind of like the daily interactions that I have with people, the daily practices that I have. And I think also one of the things that I feel a lot of gratitude for having been here, not necessarily in some sense because of the university, but I think also in the thinking through the communities that kind of move within and against it, those have been the moments that have kind of helped me do the work that I do. I mean, like for me, NAB in no small part, and like the community and the extended community that Native Americans at Brown has in no small part been just a huge motivation for this, and also a huge part of what has kind of let me find laughter in these spaces. And yeah, I think it's like doing small things. I babysit a 2-year-old, which is really helpful because it's just completely not at all related to what I'm doing. Like, I'm just kind of like, hey, do you know this history about University Hall? And he's just like, there's this really great dirt pile that I want to look at. So I think those are some sort of like helpful things of just finding like the very small stuff that allows me to I guess stay hopeful in some ways. And I think also like thinking through mourning process and understanding this as kind of like a process of grieving and coming to terms with things.
Well, thank you for sharing. I have other questions. So I know you all sent me some very academic questions, but I'm actually wondering, I think one of the things that students really worry about their freshman, sophomore year is how do I talk to professors? How did you all get your mentors? How did you work with them? When did you kind of make that step forward? I know you said since you started on campus, but what does that mean?
I took Mónica Martínez's Race and Remembering, and she was and is asking the same questions that I continue to ask in my research, and also was asking before coming to Brown. And similarly, Victor and Myacah are also some of the people who I look to who are asking those same questions. So I think it's like a matter of finding, as you can tell, because like we're on a panel together, we hang out every now and then, and so I think it's like a matter of finding out the professors who are willing to ask those questions with you, even if they haven't necessarily thought of those questions, right? But who are like willing to say like that's a good question. Let me think about that with you, and then you have a thesis or a capstone or
Just like that.
just like a collage, 9 collages, 3 collages. I don't know.
It was 9, but yeah. No, it's pretty succinct. Yeah, I just fell into it. I didn't have any grand plan. That's all.
And you? Did you have a grand plan?
I don't know if I necessarily had a grand plan. I think I was being sort of tossed between ethnic studies and public policy for a while, thinking of ways I might be able to sort of address the conditions that I grew up in, which were poverty and police violence. And I think I let the passion guide me in a lot of ways, which sounds incredibly corny, but like after you're motivated by these things and you're motivated to really, bring justice to these communities, talking to a professor doesn't seem all that hard. Talking to a professor who's interested in the same things as you doesn't seem all that difficult, because it's one incredibly necessary step to, again, imagining a better future.
What are you all doing next year?
Lord. Victor, would you like to go first?
Victor's got the.
You got the big one.
Yeah,
You got the big one.
I have the big one.
They actually know.
I'm going to be pursuing a PhD in American Studies at the University of Maryland.
Woo.
I'm still figuring. I'm going to be this summer, at least, at the Institute of Policy Studies, working on the Criminalization of Race and Poverty project. It's very exciting.
As of right now in the summer, I'm going to continue babysitting, and I'm also going to be, again, working with Mónica Martínez on her research project, so actually much of the same, much of what I've been doing for the past 3 years. And then after that, I'm also not sure, but will likely apply and matriculate into a PhD program within a couple years, but as of right now, we're still figuring it out. Yeah.
Great. All right. Does anybody have burning questions, or should I go to the ones that are on my paper here? Awesome. Go ahead.
I have one question. I'm taking this journalism class where exactly what you're saying about so all the projects about the themes that I saw were how to best present the histories accurately in effective ways, and so to a greater crowd, or a more quote unquote public crowd. But in doing the journalism class, a lot of the works that I try to do the same thing about the irrationality, they're actively rejected because they're quoted mentioned as being irrationally based. So do you have any ideas or ways to subvert that? Is there any way to accurately reflect history without being quote unquote rejected by the folks who have the power to spread the
That's a good question. I mean, the work that I was doing this past summer was about journalism and its relationship to police brutality. And so I think a couple things. One would be, I think some of the, quote-unquote professionalization standards in journalism. I think there's a real view within journalists that they're, bringers of truth and democracy or whatever other nonsense. I'm not a journalist. So that's never going to blow back on me. But, so I think there's that, which then creates a certain sense that, we're telling the real truth, or we're trying to get at the quote-unquote real truth. But I think, and I mean, you'll hear more of this at the presentation I do for ethnic studies on Monday, some of the things that we're talking about are beyond truth in a particular way, and so they can't really be captured by some of these sort of professional standards around how journalism functions. If we're thinking about racialized violence in a particular way, there's a certain way where you can't capture something about that, which I think has to do with a term like affect or embodiment or something like that. The visceral sort of nausea that racialization sort of invokes in racialized subjects is something that's not going to be captured by, a headline and a photo and a 500-word spread. The other part of the professionalization is also that they sort of tend to write their articles so that you can kind of stop after any given line break. And so really whatever is in the first 3 lines is probably what most people will read. And it's difficult to capture the sort of complexity of an event what happened in Baltimore without that. But an interesting book is Politics of Force by Regina Lawrence, about the role of police brutality in relation to journalism.
Thanks. Somebody else?
Regina Lawrence.
I saw another hand-ish. No? Go ahead.
The very local community has taken strong stances against sort of as a blanket issue, any violence. You see these 3 examples of being justified violence.
Can you repeat that?
Do you see the the three examples presented here today as justified violence, or
Would you mind clarifying what you mean by justified violence?
my first statement mentioned that any violence is pretty much condemned, especially locally. There's a strong, well, not especially local, not especially, but I think throughout is the notion that violence does not solve any problems. But on the other hand, the instances here seem to justify it, and at least as explanatory or even as justified.
I can sort of speak to that a little bit.
I mean, I think a part of what you're pointing to is I think a part of what's sort of pointed to in our projects is the way that particular mechanisms of power create what is like thought of as legitimate versus illegitimate violence. And so in particular, I think in like Phoebe's project, we're thinking about, there's particular mechanisms of the sort of overall economy as well as the development of, history itself and sort of this particular location that's enabling, dispossession, exploitation, slavery, and genocide to be thought of as legitimate, which I think then plays into how we're thinking about something like my project where, these sort of, how we think about them as a quote-unquote riot is related to thinking about them as an illegitimate sort of response to the conditions that are going on. And that's a sort of narrative that comes directly from the state and thinking about it as an illegitimate thing. They don't think that, it's illegitimate violence to place black people into cheap, housing projects at this particular time. But they do think it's illegitimate violence to break some store windows.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, so how do you see these projects developing in the future? What are you going to study, Victor?
Oh, I'm studying American Studies. This project will probably be maybe like a Slate.com article or something like that. We'll see. Well, I said my answer.
You should go, Phoebe.
I think that's the next question that I'm still thinking through, and I think that there are multiple dimensions of possibilities for some of the research that's been done in the thesis. I think in part there's some university moves that could be made that would, I think, maybe make for a better reckoning of the past than they currently we are currently doing. But I think my hope too is that it can be used by students and communities within the university and outside of the university who are trying to leverage and think through the position of the university as it exists in the present and why that might be, and what sort of past structures it's been involved in, whether in how that kind of reverberates into the present, if that makes sense. So, why is it that when we talk about free speech, free thought, that somehow is kind of seems to be also at odds with protecting people's humanities, specifically the humanity of racialized peoples on campus. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that a lot of liberal ideals that were put forth within Brown's founding charter were formed in the midst of the slave trade, in the midst of Native displacement, and it wasn't, again, those two things aren't contradictory, but were very much, involved in one another. So I think that thinking through, I hope that people can kind of continue to think through that and continue to think through what iterations of Brown's involvement in colonialism and also Brown's involvement in racist state practices continue on into the present day, and how that can be fixed, and maybe what things might not be able to be fixed, what things are kind of fundamental to the university, but kind of constantly thinking through how we can do better. Yeah.
I think about this in terms of how much longer will we continue to gut the welfare state? How much longer will we continue to put militarized weapons in the hands of police officers? And it doesn't seem like we're going to go in a positive direction with either of those things within the next 4 years, perhaps the next 8 years. And sadly, it seems as if what we're sort of left to do is sort of aid people who are the most vulnerable right now, and I guess further buttressing the case for funding homeless shelters, demilitarizing the police, and resisting in what ways we can. So I'm going to Washington now, it seems, and working in this area of policy where I do want to make sure that people's earned income tax credits aren't being reduced, that people do have access to TANF and direct welfare programs. So I think that's where I'm left with right now, thinking about, I guess, the forces that do render people homeless to begin with, and trying to mitigate that right now. That's just one sort of small tangible step. I can sort of take what I've learned here out into the real world or outside of Brown.
Thank you. So we have until 2. You guys want me to go into the heavy curricular questions here? 'Cause these guys made them up, not me. All right.
We can also ask questions.
Yeah, if you all want to ask questions, please, we would love to hear from you all, even if it's just small questions.
I would love to hear anything you have to say.
Mm-hmm. What we ate for breakfast.
Have you seen any examples of a good, well, not a good, but an accurate or effective portrayal of history, or quote unquote controversial histories?
Within our research, or kind of just more generally? Mm-hmm.
I think for me, that's really come through looking directly at the people who are homeless, asking what kinds of problems they're facing. Most people wouldn't know that homeless people are having their IDs confiscated had someone not thought to ask a homeless person what is going on. I think that kind of ethnography should inform policy now, but sadly doesn't. But it's the most authentic sort of understanding of history that I've really encountered in my work is just asking people or reading what people have asked directly to the folks living through this kind of violence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of complex work requires bringing together those ethnographies with some of the both, larger quantitative and qualitative research being done to understand some of the broader connections. So I think it's really bringing together that sort of broader view with these particularized histories, like what Myacah is doing, that enables us to get sort of a better understanding. But that's, if you want to think about what really requires a lot of work, it's that, considering how much resources went into us being able to make these projects.
Yeah, I think that, I think there's not necessarily one particular, history with a capital H that I can point to and say that. But I do think, I guess the other thing too is I think thinking through history is a process, and there should never be one big, book of history that you just sit down with and you say this is all that's happened, right? And I think that there are good history methodologies that I can point to that are based on thinking through telling and understanding the past as a living present process. I think much as Myacah was saying, and thinking through ethnographic practices and thinking through asking the people who are affected by these things, and also which isn't something we tend to do. So I think it's not so much about finding a good telling of history, but rather finding the histories, stories, and understandings of the past that use good practices, and that, more importantly, understand the telling of history as a constant present practice.
Anyone else?
So I guess for Victor, you mentioned that you will probably never hear this project again. Why did you choose to do a bunch of small projects, or what's the thinking behind putting energy into this and then putting energy into this and kind of spreading that?
I mean, I think it's probably because I didn't get the melon maze like this one. So I think that gave me some of the flexibility to work on a lot of different kinds of projects and explore different areas of my interest. And so then, yeah, this was like a final project that I did for a class that I was then able to expand a little bit, as well as, but the Royce research that I did, the other fellowship that I did last summer, my thesis, and my ethnic studies capstone are all sort of separate projects, which I think gives me some room to sort of think broadly and like differently about a lot of these things, even though they don't have some of the same depth, because I didn't spend 3 years working on them. But that's what the dissertation is for. I'll get to that.
Do you have another question?
I don't mean to put you on the spot, Phoebe, but that picture of that building on Brown in flames, what was that from?
Oh, so that was actually, do we have the clicker?
250th.
Yeah, that was the 250th. That actually, it's a great photo. It doesn't, that photo, yeah, it was just a Brown Daily Herald photo, and it was from the kickoff celebration. I like that photo a lot. That's the,
So it's Photoshopped?
no,
it was
here we'll
an
look at it.
event.
Yeah. So this was
And it
part
says
of the, it says
250
250 plus. Yeah.
Plus.
And that was part of the kickoff celebration that they had. I think it was March 7th through the 10th of 2014. And it was a 3-day long celebration, and part of the cake cutting also included this big old rig of the 250th on University Hall. A lot of interesting symbolism. If you're like trained in, I don't know, Victor, I feel like you could have an interesting conversation on on like the symbolism of having 250 plus fireworks on University Hall, which was, first edifice of the college, built by slave labor on native lands, and then you got like everyone's cutting into the cake and eating it, and it's like, what does that mean?
It didn't taste good.
It didn't taste good?
No.
It was very dry.
It was very dry.
History is dry.
Yeah, it was just a huge cake. It took
Just
a lot of
huge.
people to carry. Yeah, I know. There's a lot of like interesting, I don't know, cultural symbolism, I guess, behind all of this. That I don't really go into because I'm not really about that. But
I'm sorry, those are fireworks.
yeah, they're
Yes.
fireworks, but they also kind of look like the university is being burned down. So that's an interesting.
I was surprised it didn't, I must say.
Yeah.
It actually went off twice, the fireworks. There was one at the beginning and one at the end.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, how they do that, those
Yeah.
pyrotechnic people. And I also find, so one of the things that I find difficult is that I am in University Hall, which has this history behind it, and my job is really to make you all as welcome and helping support you as much as I can. So I always find that juxtaposition of where my position is versus what my position is, where my office is versus what my position is always a little difficult because I'm in this building.
I have a question about as you, a lot of you were talking about how your research has sort of spanned multiple years, and I think like coming to a place like Brown and sort of like being sort of like swallowed by all these different like register shifts and like sort of like diving into like higher education. I'm interested to hear how these research projects have like changed your relationships with people in like the communities that you come from, and like what your like how you sort of like how those like how your research might be informed by those communities, but also how you might be sort of like negotiating relationships along the way, and what that's felt like while you're doing that.
My grandma's very excited to read my thesis, but I don't know if she's gonna get through all of it. That's that's just like one aspect of like my community. I don't know. Do y'all want to speak on more on that?
I mean, I think it's something I'm still thinking about since I'm entering into a PhD program to like get further in the door of the academy. But I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of moments that I think having my family connection or having my community bring me back to sort of what is particularly important about the research, and not sort of getting caught up in, just talking about it in a particular way. But there's something very real to it. Like when I was working on my thesis, I, was watching this interview that Al Jazeera did with Michael Brown's mother, and sort of watching her in that moment and feeling that in a particular way. And that really felt to me in a particular way that I felt about my own mother. That could have been her in that moment, that I think was very real and not something necessarily that comes into the theory of it necessarily, but sort of affects how I write about it.
I've thought about how I articulate these things to my mother also, and often when I want to sort of delve into the theoretical aspects of it, I find that that can be a bit alienating, but also that she has her own sort of ideas that are far more complex than I think the Academy would probably give her credit for, and that honestly a lot of the knowledge is already contained in her, and it's like really up to me to sort of re-articulate it in a way that will be palatable to policymakers and palatable to people in the Academy. And also I've had to think about like the class differences now that like I'm about to graduate with 2 Ivy League degrees, and the difference that's going to make it in my life, and the real relationship to power I have versus the people who are like from my hometown, and that's been a bit strange, especially when the last election there's a lot of talk about Washington elites being out of touch with just the regular old folks, and so that's something I'm trying to be mindful of, and you can really feel it. I think when you do go to Washington, there is really a sense of elitism that is a bit distinct from here on Brown's campus. It's very similar in some ways too. That sort of almost takes pride in how disconnected it is from what's going on amongst the masses on the other side of the country in those flyover states. So I think keeping that in mind and really keeping attention between like my passion and love for like the environment that I grew up in is sort of what motivates me and really, again, like drives my work.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of this thesis was to some extent for like the communities that I come from, but I also, so I grew up in the Northeast, right? And I think that going back to like Myacah's notion of anti-Indian common sense was something that was very much embodied in the education that I got, but it was also very much at odds with the history that I knew, right? And so like I knew, histories about boarding school, histories about what it meant to be, like a Native woman, but it wasn't talked about in school. And then I also think that there's not a lot of contending in the North with how involved the American North was in the slave trade. And when I came to Rhode Island, I had no idea that Rhode Island was like the hub of the transatlantic slave trade. And so I think that to some extent, some of what my thesis is common sense that people forget, like you're on native land, common sense. People always forget that. And so that's part of what my thesis is tracing very clearly like where that act of forgetting came into being and how that happened. And so that's to some extent talking to the communities that I come from. But I think that that's also something that my family in some ways knows. And again, like I can theorize it all I want, but at the end of the day, when I was trying to explain to my dad what the heck my thesis was, he just kind of paused and was like, I think that most colleges are colonial institutions. And I was like, yeah. And he was like, yeah. And we were just like, all right, well, I'll see you later. You coming to graduation? He was like, yeah. So it's like, I don't know. I guess for me, my thesis is just kind of a really long document that's just kind of some common sense stuff that sometimes, like, when you get a little higher up, you forget. Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Yeah, so if there are no other questions, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you for this roundtable session, and we can just clap for the presenters.